My name is Corinne Halstead. I'm 38 years old, and until recently, I believed two things about myself with quiet, unshakable certainty: that my body was failing me, and that my marriage was not. I live in a pale blue craftsman house 2 blocks from City Park in Fort Collins, Colorado. In the early mornings, when the air is thin and cold and the light stretches over the foothills near Horsetooth Reservoir, the neighborhood feels honest, clean, predictable. I used to think my life was like that too. I work as a vendor contracts manager for an outdoor equipment company headquartered on the west side of town. My days revolve around spreadsheets, supplier negotiations, shipping timelines, and quarterly forecasts. I make about $67,000 a year. It's not glamorous, but it's stable. I've always liked stability. Numbers make sense to me. You plug in variables, and the results follow. If something doesn't add up, you find the discrepancy and correct it. I built my adult life around that logic. My husband, ex-husband now, was Trevor Halstead, 42, regional sales director for a medical device distributor covering northern Colorado and parts of Wyoming. His job sounded impressive in a way that impressed other people more than it impressed me. He traveled often: Denver, Cheyenne, sometimes Billings, hospital meetings, surgical demos, industry conferences at hotels with beige carpets and endless coffee. He would come home with branded pens and stories about long days and demanding surgeons. I never questioned any of it. For 12 years, I didn't. We met when I was 24 at a mutual friend's backyard barbecue in Loveland. Trevor had this calm way of speaking, like he'd already thought through everything before he said it. When he asked for my number, it didn't feel impulsive. It felt considered, safe. We married 2 years later at a small vineyard outside town. My mother cried through her entire reading. Trevor's sister, Elise, stood up during the reception and called him the most dependable man I know. I remember squeezing his hand and thinking that was exactly right. Dependable, solid, a man you could build a future with. The first 6 years of our marriage were steady in the way people mean when they say, "We're good." Not flashy, not dramatic. We took ski trips to Steamboat in the winter and camped in Rocky Mountain National Park in the summer. We saved for a kitchen renovation and spent 3 months painting cabinets ourselves because Trevor insisted labor costs were a waste. We argued about small things: whose turn it was to unload the dishwasher, whether the couch should be replaced, but nothing that felt structural, nothing that made me question the foundation. We talked about kids the way couples do when time still feels generous. Maybe next year, we'd say, let's get through this promotion cycle first. There was no urgency. We assumed biology would cooperate. Then we started trying. At first, it was almost playful, an inside project. I downloaded an ovulation tracking app that sent cheerful notifications, complete with pastel graphics and smiley faces. I cut back on coffee, switched to herbal tea, bought prenatal vitamins just in case. We laughed about timing things perfectly, about how efficient we were being. Months passed, then a year, then 2. By the 3rd year, it was no longer funny. I was scheduling OB/GYN appointments between quarterly vendor reviews. I was peeing on ovulation sticks at 5:30 in the morning before logging into budget calls. I lined up supplements on the kitchen counter: folic acid, vitamin D, zinc, CoQ10, like they were soldiers I could command into fixing something invisible. Every test came back normal, hormones within range, ovarian reserve healthy, no blockages, no structural issues. My doctor said the phrase "unexplained infertility" in a soft voice like she was cushioning a fall. I hated that phrase immediately. It sounded like a shrug, like an admission that there was no clear problem, just a quiet failure. I asked Trevor to get tested. I didn't demand it. I didn't accuse. I asked gently, more than once, spacing the conversations weeks apart so they wouldn't feel like pressure. It would just give us more information, I'd say. It's part of the process. He always had a reason. Work was intense this quarter. Insurance deductible reset in January. Stress might be affecting things anyway. "Let's not turn this into a science experiment," he'd say, kissing my forehead like I was overcomplicating something simple. It'll happen when it happens. I didn't want to become the wife who nagged. I didn't want resentment to creep into something that had always felt stable. So instead of pushing outward, I folded inward. I internalized the problem. If my body wasn't producing a child, then my body must be the issue. I monitored my temperature before getting out of bed each morning. I avoided wine at dinners with friends who were on their second pregnancies. I smiled at baby showers and cried in the shower afterward, letting the water cover the sound. By year 4, something had shifted in me. I began to believe that I was fundamentally defective in a way that couldn't be measured by blood tests. Maybe I was too career-focused, too anxious, too late, too something. Trevor would hold me when my period came each month, rubbing slow circles on my back saying, "We'll figure it out." I clung to that sentence like it was proof of love. Looking back now, what devastates me isn't the waiting. It isn't even the disappointment. It's how thoroughly I believed the problem lived inside me. How certain I was that my marriage was steady ground while my body was the unstable variable. I trusted the man beside me without reservation. I assumed that if something in our life wasn't working, the explanation would be medical or mysterious, but never intentional. I didn't know then that the equation had already been solved. Just not by me. March 12th was a Tuesday, windy in the way early spring in Colorado always is. Dry gusts rattling the porch railing and pushing last year's leaves into nervous little spirals along the sidewalk. I remember the exact time the doorbell rang because I had just closed my laptop after a long vendor call and glanced at the stove clock. 4:18 p.m. I was debating whether to go for a run before Trevor got home or give in to the kind of tired that settles behind your eyes after staring at spreadsheets all day. The house was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that used to feel peaceful. When I opened the door, a teenage boy stood on the porch, shoulders hunched against the wind. He looked about 15 or 16, tall but still unfinished somehow, like he hadn't fully grown into his limbs. Dark blonde hair fell across his forehead, and there were shadows under his eyes that didn't belong on someone his age. "Are you Corinne Halstead?" he asked. There's something about hearing your full name from a stranger that immediately tightens your chest. "Yes," I said carefully. "My mom is Claire Benton," he continued, voice steady but rehearsed. "She said you're married to Trevor Halstead." My mouth went dry. Trevor's name sounded foreign in that moment, like it belonged to a different life. The boy swallowed. "She has stage 4 ovarian cancer. She doesn't have long. She told me to find you, to tell you the truth." For a second, the wind was the only thing making noise. I felt my fingers tighten around the edge of the door. "What truth?" I heard myself ask. "My name is Mason," he said. "I'm 14. He paused there, like he was waiting for something to click inside me. It didn't. Not yet. "My mom and Trevor have been together for 9 years. 9. The number landed heavily, but didn't immediately make sense. It felt abstract, like he'd said 90. "They met at a sales conference in Denver," Mason continued, the words coming in the same careful cadence. "She said it wasn't supposed to last. But it did." I leaned against the doorframe because the porch felt like it was tilting. 9 years. We'd been married 12, which meant 3 years into our marriage, while we were still picking paint colors for the kitchen cabinets, Trevor had started another life. Then Mason said it plainly. "He's my dad." The sentence split the air cleanly. I stared at him, really looked at him this time. The line of his jaw, the way his eyes narrowed slightly when the wind hit them. Something familiar flickered there, something I'd seen across a dinner table for over a decade. "How old are you?" I asked, even though he'd already told me. 14. 14. 14 meant Trevor had been 28 when Mason was born, the year before we got engaged. My mind began rearranging timelines at a frantic pace, trying to locate reality inside them. "And there's something else," Mason said, almost like he didn't want to. I braced myself without knowing for what. "My mom said he had a vasectomy the year I was born. He said he didn't want more kids complicating things." The world didn't spin. It didn't blur. It sharpened. Trevor had a vasectomy. 14 years ago. Which meant that when we stood under twinkle lights at that vineyard in Loveland and promised to build a family together, he already knew that would never happen. Which meant every time I cried in our bathroom over another negative pregnancy test, he knew why. Which meant every time he told me, "It'll happen when it happens," he was performing. I felt something inside me go very still. Not loud, not explosive, just still. Mason reached into his backpack and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "She printed things," he said. In case you didn't believe me. I took it automatically. She didn't want to die without telling you, he added. She said you deserved to know. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. Does she know you're here? I asked. He nodded. I told her I'd go today. She said you seemed like a good person. That sentence nearly undid me more than anything else. I didn't invite him inside. I don't know if that makes me cruel or simply stunned. We stood there in the wind for another few seconds that stretched longer than they should have. I'm sorry, Mason said quietly. Not defensive, not angry, just tired. For what? I asked. For this, he replied. After he left, after I watched him walk down the sidewalk, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, I closed the door and locked it out of habit. I didn't open the envelope right away. I walked to the kitchen, set it on the counter, stared at it like it might start explaining itself. 9 years, 14-year-old son, vasectomy, the infertility appointments, the supplements, the quiet shame I'd been carrying like it was my own failure. It hadn't been mysterious. It hadn't been unexplained. It had been engineered. I slid down to the kitchen floor and sat there, back against the cabinets, the envelope still unopened on the counter above me. The grief that rose up wasn't sharp. It was vast and slow and suffocating. 5 years of believing my body was defective. 5 years of carefully timed intimacy. 5 years of Trevor holding me while I cried over something he had already ensured would never happen. The wind rattled the windows again, but inside the house, everything was silent. And for the first time in 12 years, I realized I did not know the man I had married. I didn't open the envelope until after the sun went down. Trevor texted at 5:42 p.m. to say he'd be late. Dinner with St. Anthony's team ran long. Don't wait up. I stared at the message longer than necessary, noticing how ordinary it looked. No hint of panic, no shift in tone, just the same smooth rhythm he'd used for years. I placed my phone face down on the counter and finally tore open the manila envelope. Inside were printed screenshots, neatly organized with paper clips separating sections. Claire had been methodical. Or maybe she'd known that if she was going to dismantle someone's marriage, it had to be undeniable. The first stack was messages, texts between Trevor and Claire going back years, pet names, inside jokes, complaints about work, discussions about Mason's math grades and orthodontist appointments, plans for weekends in Estes Park. In one thread from 3 years ago, Trevor wrote, "I'll tell her soon, after this quarter settles down." In another, a year later, "I just need the right time." The right time had apparently been pending for nearly a decade. The second stack was photos. Those were harder. Trevor in a hospital room holding a newborn wrapped in a striped blanket. Trevor crouched beside a small boy at a soccer field, hand on his shoulder. Trevor at what looked like a middle school awards ceremony, arm around Mason, pride obvious in the way he stood. I studied his face in those photos. He looked relaxed, open, present. There were holiday pictures, too. Christmas mornings in a living room I didn't recognize. Mason tearing open gifts while Trevor sat behind him, smiling. I thought about all the Decembers Trevor had claimed he needed to travel for year-end hospital contracts. All the nights I'd reheated leftovers alone and told myself marriage meant flexibility. The third stack was financial records, screenshots of bank transfers, $1,200, $400, $800, regular, consistent, tuition payments, sports fees, insurance for Mason's first car. I recognized the account number immediately. It was our joint account. The fourth section was what made my stomach drop. Documents from a home equity line of credit, $142,000 opened 5 years ago. Disbursement records that lined up with a down payment on a townhome in Windsor. Claire's address typed clearly across the top of one printed page. And there, at the bottom of the loan agreement, was my name, my signature, except it wasn't mine. I've signed my name thousands of times, contracts, tax returns, birthday cards. My handwriting slopes slightly to the right. The capital C loops back in a specific way. The signature on that document was close, but not close enough. Trevor hadn't just funded a second life. He'd used our house to do it. I sat at the kitchen table and did what I always do when something doesn't make sense. I calculated. 5 years of tuition, sports fees, car insurance, monthly transfers averaging $1,500, the equity line, the renovation we never finished because Trevor said we needed to be cautious this year. The money had been there. It had just been redirected. I thought about the evenings I'd suggested we take a weekend trip, and Trevor had frowned slightly, talking about budgeting. I thought about the time I'd asked if we could explore IVF, and he'd hesitated, saying it might strain us financially. Strain us, while he was financing another household 20 miles away. I didn't cry. That surprised me most. Instead, a kind of clarity settled in. The infertility, the avoidance of testing, the gentle reassurances, the calm refusals. It all rearranged itself into a coherent narrative. Trevor had already had the child he wanted. He had sealed that decision medically. And then he had watched me dismantle myself, trying to produce something he had already ensured would never happen. I went upstairs to our bedroom and opened the drawer where we kept important documents. Passports, insurance papers, tax returns. I searched for any record of the home equity line. There was nothing, which meant he had handled it entirely on his own, which meant he had signed my name, forged it. The word felt heavy and criminal in a way I hadn't yet allowed myself to process. I sat on the edge of our bed and replayed the last 5 years in fragments. The supplements lined up on the counter, the ovulation charts, the night I cried because my doctor suggested we consider alternative family planning. Trevor had held me that night, told me I was enough. He had said, "We'll figure it out." He already had. The garage door rumbled open at 8:17 p.m. I heard Trevor's footsteps in the kitchen, the familiar clink of keys in the bowl by the door, the sound of him opening the fridge. "Hey," he called casually. "You still up?" "Yes," I answered, my voice steady in a way that felt almost detached. I didn't confront him that night, not because I was weak, not because I was unsure, but because I understood something new about him. Trevor operated best when he felt in control, when the narrative belonged to him. For the first time in our marriage, it didn't. I needed facts, documentation, legal advice, not a screaming match in the kitchen. So instead, I slid the envelope back together. I placed it in my desk drawer. I brushed my teeth beside him in the bathroom mirror, studying his reflection carefully. He looked the same, which might have been the most chilling part of all. That night, as he slept beside me, breathing evenly, one arm draped across my waist, I stared at the ceiling and let the truth settle into place. My infertility hadn't been unexplained. It had been orchestrated. And whatever happened next would not be spontaneous. It would be deliberate. The next morning, I called in sick, not because I was falling apart, though part of me was, but because I needed silence. I needed space to think without fluorescent office lights and vendor emails demanding answers about shipment delays. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and the envelope spread out in front of me, like evidence in a case I hadn't agreed to prosecute. The first thing I did was pull our mortgage records. It took less than 10 minutes to access the county database online. Public records are brutally efficient that way. If your name is attached to something, it's there for anyone patient enough to search. There it was. Home equity line of credit, $142,000. Opened 5 years ago. Borrower, Trevor Halstead and Corinne Halstead. My name sat neatly typed beneath his. I clicked on the scanned document and zoomed in until the signature filled the screen. I studied it clinically. The slant was off. The pressure too even. My real signature has a slight hesitation in the second L. The one on this document flowed too smoothly, like someone trying to imitate confidence they didn't naturally possess. I hadn't signed it. I would have remembered authorizing 6 figures against our home. I would have remembered sitting at a closing table. I would have remembered something. Instead, I remembered Trevor telling me 5 years ago that we should hold off on IVF consultations because we needed to be financially cautious. I remembered him saying the housing market was unpredictable, that we should build more equity before making big decisions. He had built equity. Then he'd extracted it. The transaction history attached to the credit line confirmed what the screenshots from Claire's envelope suggested. Disbursements matched the down payment on a townhome in Windsor. Several large transfers aligned with Mason's private school tuition. Smaller but consistent payments flowed into an account I didn't recognize. Our house had funded their life. I leaned back in my chair and did what I always do when faced with overwhelming information. I compartmentalized. Affair, emotional betrayal. Secret child, moral betrayal. Vasectomy, calculated deception. Forged loan documents, criminal act. One of these things didn't belong solely in the realm of divorce. I called an attorney before I could talk myself out of it. Her name was Dana Whitmore. A colleague at work had mentioned her years ago during a messy separation. She doesn't waste time, my coworker had said, and she doesn't scare easily. Dana's office was in a brick building near Old Town Fort Collins. Minimal decor, framed degrees, a conference table that had likely hosted more imploding marriages than I could imagine. She listened without interrupting while I walked her through everything. The infertility, Mason's visit, the envelope, the vasectomy, the loan. She didn't gasp. She didn't offer sympathetic noises. She asked questions. Do you have access to all joint financial accounts? Yes. Has he ever restricted your access to funds? No. Did you sign any documents related to that equity line? No. She nodded once and slid the copy of the loan agreement closer. This, she said calmly, tapping the signature, is not just marital misconduct. If you did not authorize this, it's fraud. The word settled heavily in the room. Fraud. I had been thinking betrayal, infidelity, manipulation. Fraud was colder, more precise. Dana outlined next steps with surgical clarity. Forensic document examination, subpoena for medical records to confirm the vasectomy date, full financial tracing to follow the money trail from the equity line to its endpoints. If the signature is forged, she continued, and the funds were used to support a separate household without your knowledge, this becomes both a civil and potentially criminal matter. I absorbed that slowly. Trevor wasn't just a liar. He might be prosecutable. The forensic document examiner's report came back within 2 weeks. I provided samples of my real signature, tax returns, employment contracts, my driver's license application from years ago. The analysis was unequivocal. The signature on the loan documents was not written by the same hand. Different pen pressure, different baseline alignment, artificial consistency, forged. Dana filed motions for access to medical records next. When the vasectomy confirmation arrived, it included the procedure date, 6 months before our wedding. He had stood at that altar already sterilized, already aware, already committed to a life that excluded the children he'd promised we would try to have. When I finally confronted Trevor, I didn't scream. I didn't throw the envelope. I didn't cry. I placed the documents on the dining table and said, "You forged my signature." He went pale before he even reached the vasectomy records. His first instinct wasn't denial, it was negotiation. "I was going to tell you," he said quickly. "I just needed the right time." The right time. 9 years, 14-year-old son. 5 years of me blaming my body. "And the loan?" I asked. Silence. He began talking about love, about complicated feelings, about not wanting to hurt anyone. Love does not involve forging your spouse's name on 6-figure financial documents. Love does not involve sterilizing yourself and watching your wife grieve a manufactured loss. The divorce filing included fraud, dissipation of marital assets, and intentional deception. But the equity line elevated it beyond divorce. The district attorney's office reviewed the forensic report and the financial tracing. Within weeks, an investigation opened into the forged loan. Trevor had always been meticulous about his professional reputation. He managed surgical equipment contracts worth millions. Hospitals trusted him with compliance documentation and regulatory integrity. Now his own paperwork was under scrutiny. I didn't celebrate that. I didn't feel vindictive. What I felt was something cleaner, clarity. For years, I had believed the problem in my life was invisible and unsolvable, something inside me that doctors couldn't identify. Instead, the problem had been tangible, documented, signed in ink that wasn't mine. And for the first time since that windy Tuesday in March, the numbers added up. The legal process moved faster than I expected. Once the district attorney's office reviewed the forensic handwriting analysis and the financial tracing Dana compiled, the case stopped being theoretical. The forged home equity documents weren't ambiguous. My signature had been fabricated. The funds had been routed directly into a property purchase and ongoing support for a second household. It wasn't messy marital he said, she said. It was paper, dates, transfers, intent. Trevor was indicted on felony fraud charges before summer. He tried to convince me to keep this civil. That phrase still echoes in my head. As if forging my name to extract $142,000 from our home and financing a secret life for nearly a decade had been civil. as if I had escalated something instead of responding to it. His attorney eventually advised him to accept a plea deal. The evidence was too clean. A trial would have dragged everything out publicly and risked a harsher sentence. He pled guilty to reduced felony charges, agreed to restitution for the loan amount, and received supervised probation with mandatory financial monitoring. His employer terminated him within days of the charges becoming public record. Hospitals and medical device companies don't retain executives convicted of financial crimes. Trust is currency in that industry. He had spent the divorce finalized 3 months later. Because of the fraud, the asset division wasn't a negotiation, it was a correction. The house on Maple Street was awarded solely to me. The remaining balance on the equity line became Trevor's responsibility under the restitution order. Retirement accounts were split in my favor to account for the dissipation of marital assets. The numbers were laid out clinically in court documents. Precise, unemotional. Yet beneath those numbers was something far less tidy. Claire passed away 2 months after Mason showed up at my door. I never met her. We never spoke. But I sent flowers to the funeral home with a simple card that read, "Thank you for telling the truth." It felt important to acknowledge that choice. She could have stayed silent. She could have preserved whatever version of stability existed for her son. Instead, she handed me the information that allowed me to stop doubting myself. Mason lives with his aunt in Boulder now. We exchanged 2 emails. Brief, careful. I told him none of this was his fault. I meant it. Children do not create betrayal. They're born into it. I don't know if he'll ever fully untangle his own version of this story. I hope he does. The first night I slept alone in the house felt strange in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not frightening, not sad, just unfamiliar. I lay in the center of the bed and listened to the house settle. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a car passing on Maple Street, the small creak in the hallway floorboards I'd always blamed on seasonal expansion. The silence wasn't heavy, it was clean. I refinanced the mortgage in my name only. The bank required updated income verification, fresh appraisals, stacks of paperwork I handled myself. When I signed the final documents at closing, I took a moment to study my own signature on the page, the slant, the loop in the C, the slight hesitation in the second L. It was mine. Entirely mine. I opened a separate savings account the week the divorce was finalized. I transferred $50 into it that first day, not because $50 changes a life, but because control does. I add to it every month now, quietly, deliberately. The hardest part of all of this wasn't the courtroom. It wasn't seeing Trevor's name listed under criminal charges. It wasn't even the financial damage. It was the years I lost believing I was broken. 5 years of ovulation charts. 5 years of supplements lined up on the kitchen counter like a ritual. 5 years of quietly shrinking inside myself every time someone asked, "So when are you two having kids?" Trevor didn't just lie. He allowed me to internalize a narrative that absolved him completely. He let me question my body, my timing, my worth, while knowing the biological outcome had been determined long before we said our vows. That realization took longer to process than the fraud. Healing hasn't been dramatic. There was no singular breakthrough moment where everything snapped back into place. It has been incremental. Early morning hikes up Horsetooth Rock, where the air feels sharp and honest in my lungs. Sitting at my kitchen table with coffee and realizing no one is manipulating the financial spreadsheet of my life. Looking at my calendar and knowing that every appointment, every plan, every decision belongs to me. Some weeks, I don't think about Trevor at all. That might be the clearest measure of recovery. I'm 38 years old. My body was never defective. My marriage was constructed around a lie, and lies eventually collapse under their own weight. Now, when I stand on my front porch in the evening and watch the light fade over the foothills, the future feels uncertain, but not controlled by someone else's hidden decisions. It feels open, unwritten. For the first time in 12 years, the life ahead of me is not being managed behind my back. It's mine. And that difference changes everything. Life has a way of revealing the truth, sometimes gently, sometimes with court documents. Trust your instincts, check the paperwork, and never confuse silence with peace. If something feels off, investigate. Clarity is power. And if you enjoy stories where karma keeps immaculate records, subscribe to the Revenge Protocol YouTube channel. Leave a comment too. I read them all, and justice loves good audience participation.